The political and social repression of women in many parts of the Arab world is not new. Cases of rape and assault are rampant in nations such as Sudan, Somalia and Egypt. And even in the wealthy Gulf nations, women are fighting for basic rights and freedoms. Joining me now from Copenhagen is Maryam al-Khawaja. She is a Bahraini human rights activist and co-director of the Gulf Center for Human Rights. Maryam, thanks for joining us.
My pleasure.
I want to talk first about political change that has been taking place in the Middle East, the so-called Arab Spring. Over the last 2 years, we've seen quite a bit of change. What has that done for women's rights?
Well, I think it depends really on which country you're speaking about. When we're looking at the situation for women in places like Syria or Bahrain, it's gotten much worse. Or if we're talking about Egypt, it's also gotten worse to some extent. Not as bad as it could have gotten, but it is getting worse. In Tunisia, the government is trying to repel some of the rights that women have. They haven't been successful, though. So it really depends from one country to another. The situation is different. But I think generally speaking, I can say that the situation has gotten worse and deteriorated for most people, including women.
Women have played a very big role in the Arab Spring in the Middle East, yet they get so little credit for it.
And it's not only credit. When we're looking at the situation in general, yes, looking at these situations, it's always about the politicians who are mainly male. So even though women take a large role in the protest movements themselves within the streets, a lot of the politicians who then end up making the deals or end up getting into the government or whatever are usually male. And that's why a lot of times the role of the woman is overlooked and underplayed. But then we also have the situation of gender-specific violations that are done to women in many of these countries. For example, things like rape or sexual torture. In Egypt, for example, we saw the virginity testing. In Bahrain, we had Rayhan al-Musawi, who was stripped naked and forced to stand in the doorway so people can look at her as a form of psychological torture. And so there are also gender-based techniques that are used specifically for women within these countries. And I think one of the most disturbing trends is how many of these governments will actually have one or two women who they will portray as being progressive and feminist within the government system to try and portray outside the borders of this country that the government is actually very fond of women's rights and that they do have women in government. For example, in Bahrain, we have Samira Rajab, who's the Minister of Information. And she's portrayed as someone who's progressive and who's a feminist and so on. And yet she helps whitewash the regime's violations, especially those against women as well.
And yet, if we look at some of the figures which have been put out by the World Economic Forum, 10 Arab countries are among the worst 25 offenders when it comes to gender equality in the world. Bahrain is very high up there, so is Qatar, so is Egypt, Iran, Oman. In these countries, have you seen any changes at all? Do you see a pathway towards things improving for women?
Unfortunately, the way we're looking at the situation right now, we're seeing a deterioration. And I think that the situation of women and the abuses against women, we're not supposed to just look at the situation right now within the uprisings. We're looking at a situation where there's a problem within the system itself. There's already a problem of the absence of presence of equality within the law for women. And then because also we have added, the situation of impunity for people who work for the government. So any women who are married to or involved with men who work for the government who enjoy impunity means they don't have any rights within the system either. And so there are so many different levels and layers to violations against women in these countries. And of course, especially in places like Bahrain and the Gulf in general, we're looking at a situation where these governments and regimes not only have cultures of impunity locally, but they're also enjoying, unfortunately, international impunity that is provided for them by their allies. For example, Bahrain, despite everything they've done over the past 2.5 years since the mass protests started for democracy and human rights, they've been given a free pass internationally by their allies like the United States, like the United Kingdom, where we have yet to see any real consequences being put against them because of the violations that they've committed, whether against women specifically or the Bahraini population in general.
What would you like to see from these countries?
I think that the international community definitely has a responsibility, especially when it's their allies. If you want to judge countries who say that they hold democracy and human rights as the cornerstone of their foreign policy, if you want to judge them on how well that's implemented, you shouldn't ask whether they're implementing it on governments that they don't like. We should ask whether they're implementing it and holding to account governments that are their allies. And in the case of countries like the UK and the US specifically, but also the EU in general, we're looking at a situation where their allies get a free pass, where human rights violations suddenly are not as important because of the economic and political and security relationship that they have with these countries. And so they need to start treating their allies the same way they treat the governments that they don't like and hold them to account when it comes to human rights violations.
You know, we live in a changing world, of course, and it's changing very quickly, especially. We are now in the era of globalization. And I was wondering, in many respects, to what extent do conservative religious beliefs or traditional norms impact this kind of gender inequality that we're talking about in the Middle East?
Well, I think it's difficult to put all of the countries into one basket. You know, you can't say that in general, this is the situation for women in the Middle East, because it's actually very, very different from one country to another. For example, in Bahrain, you have the cultural aspect of it, but Bahrain, to the most part, is pretty liberal compared to its neighbors. In places like Saudi Arabia, for example, I would say a lot more so than in places like Bahrain, because in Saudi Arabia, for example, every woman has to have a male guardian. So the guardian system, where the woman needs permission from a male guardian to do just about anything. And this is something that also has played into the cultural norms and not just the political aspect. But I think that these two things, the cultural norms and the legal system and the way that the system is set up, they actually feed off of each other.
Right, you know, something...
So they go hand in hand.
Yeah, something like it. It seems so ingrained in the society, say in Saudi Arabia. Are you hopeful that that will change?
I think that, yes, it's a situation that can't continue for too long. I mean, we're already seeing movements within these countries where women are pushing for change despite all of the risks that they face for doing so. In Saudi Arabia, just, you know, this past period, we've been seeing these movements of women saying that they will drive despite them not being allowed to. And not only have they been doing it, but we've seen support for these women from some of the male citizens in Saudi Arabia who have not only supported the campaign, but have actually helped their mothers and wives and sisters in actually taking the car and going out for a drive and driving with them as support. And so I think we're definitely looking at a situation where it's going to take a long time, but I think we're on the road to that change.
Okay, Maryam, we're going to have to leave it there. Thanks for joining us.
My pleasure.